If you want to sleep with one eye open this summer, I've got 3 true stories that will do the job. One takes place in a forgotten basement beneath a school that half the town swore had been a hospital. One happens at a costume party that turned into something like a trap in the woods. The last, and the one that still makes my chest tighten most nights, is about a student who showed up where he had no business being, inside my house. I tell them the way I remember them. Foggy around the edges, raw in the moments that mattered. Details may be imperfect, but the feeling of each night is burned in me like a scar. I always tell these with a laugh when I can. It's a nervous habit. It makes people lean in, and it keeps me from looking at how much quieter my house has gotten since. I was that kid people labeled nerd without malice, books over parties, science fairs instead of spring break road trips. That image made me perfect bait for these kinds of stories, because I had the kind of friends who liked to dare, and the type of bravado that only lasts until something actually lunges at you. The first one starts near the end of senior year. There was a rumor going around that our old private school, the one with the ivy on the columns and the stone gargoyles, had once been built on the site of a hospital. You'd hear the story at 2 a.m. in group chats between half-remembered details and bad memes. Bones found during renovations, a bricked-over wing, a maintenance tunnel that fed into the sewer. Urban Legend 101. People added flourishes until the tale had a pulse. There was a kid, Steve, who liked to push stories farther than they needed to go. He told people he'd been down in the old wing the week before, and that something had talked to him. Not in a boo way, in a "it told me my name" way. Of course, Steve was the kind of guy who loved the attention. He leaned into it until it landed him in trouble for something else entirely, and he ended up suspended. Maybe expelled. I can't say with absolute certainty now. Memory erodes fastest where shame and adrenaline cross. Carson, who was the janitor's kid and had a way of getting into places no one else dared to ask about, invited a small, stupidly confident group of us to go prove Steve a liar. We rationalized it, like adults rationalize anything dumb, as investigatory work. We'd show up, walk around, film a bit for laughs, toss it into the group chat, and watch Steve's legend get shriveled up like a pop balloon. It felt like a prank. It felt like something we could laugh about later. I'll be careful describing how we got in, because I don't want to provide a how-to for kids with flashlights and poor judgment. What matters is we were there late, after the fluorescent lights in the main hall had gone to that pale, haunted flicker they get when the power's about to give up. The building smelled like old library glue and something more medicinal under everything. A sharp metallic tang that made the back of my throat tighten. We moved past trophies and faded class photos, the air colder down the marble stairs. Someone had painted a crude handprint in red on a locker. Nothing graphic, just a smear that caught the light and made everyone in our group pause for a beat. Basements in buildings like that always looked like they were divorced from time. Old janitorial carts, porcelain sinks with chips, a single bulletin board with faded flyers about a recital in '92. Then there was the door with the rusted padlock, not locked, just hanging there like a warning we've all agreed to ignore. Carson laughed and pushed it. It opened into a narrower corridor that smelled worse, like damp and old bandages. We joked as we went down, because that's what you do to keep your hands from trembling. Someone had brought one of those cheap LED flashlights. The beam cut a narrow tunnel of illumination, and everything else crawled into black. Statues with chipped noses cast weird, sideways shadows that looked like people watching. At one point I knelt to see a handful of muddy footprints leading toward a shorter door in the far wall, a hole at its base, like something had been squeezed through. There was a tension that makes you feel both childish and petrified, the exact place where teenage dares meet a real sense of wrongness. Carson crawled in first. He had this ridiculous confidence because his dad held the keys, or at least that's what he said. He disappeared into the small hole, the beam of his flashlight bobbing and soon swallowed. After a moment, we heard him whisper something stupid and triumphant, and then a sound that made every smart, rational part of me go cold. A deep, slow whooshing, like breath dragging across a floor of stone. It escalated into a whisper layered over the whoosh, too soft at first for comprehension, but in that echoing space, it felt like it came from all directions. The kind of whisper you only hear when the rest of the world stops announcing itself. I'm not proud of what I did next. I guess I thought the bravado would protect me if I led. So I crawled in. The hole was narrower than I expected. My mouth filled with the metallic tang of the place. My knuckles scraped the stone. And for a second, I thought about how stupid it was to be in a tunnel built because someone once thought putting 2 rooms side by side would be a good idea. The floor was slick with something damp. I tasted dust. My flashlight's beam caught a line of something red on the wall, but it was old, probably paint, and it smeared when I brushed it. Little roots grew through the mortar, reaching like fingers. The whisper got clearer the deeper I went. It sounded like syllables without words, a rhythm someone could slip meaning into if you were willing to let them. My breath came out of me in shallow, embarrassed gasps. Carson's light bobbed ahead like a lighthouse you could never quite reach. Then the whisper stopped, as if someone had turned off a radio. The silence roared. I remember the way my ears seemed too loud, a wet popping at the back of my skull. And then, in a little elbow of the tunnel where the ceiling dipped, a figure moved into our flash. At first I thought it was a mannequin left behind by some old school play. Then the light hit a rib, a stark, pale line under skin that hung too close to bone. Shirtless, wet hair plastered to its skull. Its eyes were the thing I'm chasing in my head on nights when the house is too quiet. Hollow, not empty exactly, but like someone had cleared the furniture out of them. They looked straight through our light. It lunged. It was quick in a way nothing standing that emaciated should be. One moment it was a shape, the next it was a rush of air and a wet hand slapping my arm. I don't remember thinking words. I remember the sound of leather, someone's sleeve, and the smell of something old and human and wrong. Hands were on me and not on me, a flurry of arms, a yelp that could have been mine or Carson's, shoes banging on stone. Teeth of terror gritted my jaw so hard it hurt. We scrambled out the way we came, slipping on the damp, trading the claustrophobic black for the fluorescent hum of the corridor above. Outside, breath raked the night and the air seemed impossibly clean. We collapsed against a broom closet door, hearts banging. For a while no one spoke, because saying things out loud feels like confirming that what you just fled from was real. Carson swore, words I can't repeat, and someone laughed, a high, thin thing that was more a sound to keep us from unraveling. We left the way teenagers who've done something stupid always leave, fast, with too much adrenaline and too little processing. I went home and shook for an hour, then tried to sleep, and woke to replay the image of those eyes in the same looping way terrible movies burrow into your head. The rational explanation is simple, and I don't dodge it. There are a lot of people without homes in this town. There are broken adults who find shelter in basements and tunnels. Maybe that's what we found. Maybe the person had been living there for a while, and the flashlight frightened them. Maybe hunger and cold had made them thin and quick with fear. The thought that we had surprised someone in their shelter, and that we had been the threat, is something I still roll over in my head. It makes the embarrassment of getting caught doing something stupid worse, because it sits next to a real human suffering that we had no business disturbing. But the eyes didn't look like the universe of someone surviving. They seemed like something that had been forcefully cleared out, or maybe like someone whose fears had gone so deep they hollowed out the parts you use to recognize another person. Maybe I'm letting a story fill the gaps. Maybe time edits your memory like a film director with an agenda. I tell you all this because I do not want to be one of those narrators who claims certainty. I can't prove what that was. The only thing I can swear to is how my stomach has felt when I close my eyes since. A small, persistent ache beneath my ribs, like a door that you think is shut, but isn't. We told people we'd found nothing. That was a lie wrapped in cowardice. It sounded cleaner than saying we'd been chased. Steve's story remained a ridiculous campfire tale, and some people still mocked him for embellishing. We learned our lesson in the blunt way teenagers learn things, not from moral reflection, but from fear. For weeks after, I would take the long way home when the sun was going down. I stopped lingering in shadows with my friends. The bravado that got us into the tunnel retreated like a tide that had touched something sharp and never fully came back. If this is creeping you out, drop a comment. What would you have done in that tunnel? I actually want to know. Asking strangers on the internet questions is one of my ways of feeling less alone when I replay the hallways of that place in my head. That was the night that taught me how fast the world can change, from something to laugh about to something that makes you revise how you move through it. It taught me that curiosity is a dangerous currency, and that the people who rush to prove ghosts wrong often wind up with a story they'd rather not own. I tried to shrug it off as we drifted into the last days of school. Finals and graduation ceremonies followed in a blur. Everyone welded themselves to plans and summer roofs. I should have been excited. Everyone is supposed to be excited about everything at that age, but the inspection of that tunnel had put a new map in my head. There are places a person can go where the air feels wrong. There are places you once roamed that suddenly hold the pressure of being watched. Which brings us to the party. The party was Logan's idea, which meant two things. It would be loud, and it would attract everyone within a 2-mile radius who thought college summers began the second finals ended. Logan had a house on the edge of town that felt too big for one person, and everyone treated it like an invitation. The theme for the night was costumes, half mock Halloween, half just because. I wore a hockey mask because it was easy, and because masks are a favorite of mine when I want to feel detached from consequences. It's funny how a stupid rubber faceplate can make you feel braver. The music was a low, thrumming presence in the backyard. The air tasted like smoke from the grill and spilled cheap beer. People were draped across lawn chairs and concrete steps, conversations flickering and dying. The house lights made everyone's breath visible as they moved. In a crowd that was mostly laughter and sloppy hugs, the girl in the gold masquerade mask landed like a punctuation mark. She was oddly still, like someone who belongs to a different story. The mask reflected streetlight, turning her face into an anonymous glint. She caught my eye from the edge of the yard, and then she gestured just once, like the kind of slow, deliberate motion actors use when they want the audience to follow them. I was, of course, the idiot who followed. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from being part of a group. You feel safer in numbers, even if it's only the number of your self-appointed courage. Besides, what harm could come from walking a few steps into some trees? The sound changed when I left the lawn. The bass dulled, muffled by leaves. Shadows became thicker, and the flash of the gold mask disappeared between trunks. She walked without haste, as if she had this route memorized. The path, if you could call it that, was rimed with crushed leaves and old cigarette butts, and every time I stepped, I heard twigs snap like small betrayals. Her laugh was a little muffled through the mask, like a radio with bad reception. It was only when she stopped and turned toward me that I noticed how empty the woods felt. In the city, the trees are always full of noise. Out here, it was like someone had turned off the world. She didn't say anything at first. She tilted her head, and it struck me as a deliberate, intimate gesture, the same look someone uses when asking a question they don't expect you to answer. I felt stupidly charmed. I felt like a character in one of those movies where a masked stranger shows up and things get romantic or mysteriously dangerous in a glamorous way. I suppose that's what the mask is for. To let you imagine yourself in a story you didn't write. Then she reached out and touched my arm. It was brief, a feather of contact, but it sounded like something large in me unspooled. She dropped something on the ground by my feet. It was small, heavy in the dark, and when my hand closed around it, I realized it was the gold mask itself. There was no voice, no explanation. Her hand had been on mine for a beat long enough for me to think she was warm. Then she stepped back. A noise off to my right, branches scuffling, made me start. I turned, and there was nothing but the trace of footprints starting behind, where she had been standing, and leading deeper into the trees. The mask at my feet glinted like an accusation. I picked it up more because I didn't know what else to do, and then she was right there again, as if she'd appeared from nowhere, and I could see the eyes through the slits of gold. She was beautiful in the way people in masks can be more interesting than those without one. You want to look longer because the mask promises you a story. I was smiling in that daft, stupid way people smile when someone flirts with them in the dark. Then she reached up and pulled the edge of the mask away from one cheek. For a second the mask hid her eyes. When it came down again, the face beneath was familiar. I stopped breathing. My mouth felt dry, and the moon somehow got brighter, like a spotlight. It was someone I knew, not a famous friend, not a stranger, the kind of person whose face you'd see in the hallway between classes and shrug at. Someone from the tail end of a relationship I thought had ended quietly and without drama. An ex, the sort whose fights you file away in the weir fine drawer and close. Seeing them there in the woods with a gold mask made my stomach fold over itself. It felt wrong in the way wrong things do, sharp, precise, like an intake of cold air on the first day of winter. For a beat, we froze. The leaves around us paused their soft chatter. The party noise dimmed to a distant heartbeat. The masked girl, who had been an instrument of my curiosity a second before, now seemed like a pivot. The light sliced her face strangely. In that slice I saw every stupid thing I'd done with this person, every petty argument. I remembered closing the drawer in my head and thinking, like a child, that closings are permanent. Her eyes, the eyes without the mask, were serious in a way I hadn't expected. There was none of the flirtatious sparkle I'd imagined. Instead, there was that same steady, quiet look I'd seen once before and chosen to ignore. For a moment I thought she was about to laugh, to remove the drama. Maybe she would say some line about costumes and coincidence. Maybe we'd stand there and clap each other on the shoulder like teenagers who almost made a scene. Then, from deeper in the trees, something else moved. It was not the girl. It was a shape that had been waiting or watching or both. The branches shivered. A step came like a punctuation mark. I remember tasting copper in my mouth. The air tightened. I didn't get to understand it then. I only had that absurd window of awareness where your brain logs details like a crime scene investigator while your legs calculate escape routes. The first real thing I registered was the feel of the rubber bat in someone's hands swinging. And that's where the story picks up speed in a way I don't like to tell too quickly. The bit I've just told you is the gentle pull before the trap snaps. The woods, which had been a place of novelty and bravado, shifted into the framework of a trap. The gold mask, the turning of a face I thought I recognized, the sense that something planned and vicious was using me as bait. This is the point where I should stop and tell you where my feet were planted and exactly which direction I ran. But memory is a traitor in these moments. It offers only flashes. I remember the bat, the smell of dust rising from the forest floor, the way my throat tightened into something small and metallic. I remember thinking very clearly that the world had become a place where someone I'd dated could have been pushed to something I never imagined. I'll pause there because that pause is where the real thing begins, where plans unspool and choices get made fast and stupid and entirely human. You can feel the air change in your chest when a memory hits that spot where laughter used to live. That same feeling is the thread that ties all three of these nights together, the sudden tilt from "this is a story" to "this is happening." The bat came down before my brain had fully labeled it as violence. Everything after that first swing is a collage of tiny, frantic images. The rubber cracking against something that wasn't meant to take blows, the slap of leaves underfoot like 100 small alarms, the taste of dust and a wild, acidic fear in my mouth. My hands threw up in a reflex. I don't remember if I pushed or ducked first. I only know my body chose a direction, and I followed like an animal. The woods chewed up my breath and spat it back as I ran, the gold mask still damp in my fist like proof that I'd been willingly led into a trap. I heard her voice, the ex's voice, somewhere behind me, brittle and raw. I can't give you the exact words because trauma doesn't hand you dialogue on a silver platter the way movies do. It handed me impressions. There was pleading in her tone, or maybe that was my head misfiling the memory as an explanation I didn't deserve. There was anger that smelled like old arguments and bruised pride, and there was the flurry of footsteps that meant whoever had been waiting was now in motion. I hit the edge of the yard, and the sudden light of the party felt obscene. People were laughing, hairline still from the pressure of watching. Logan was yelling somebody's name like an auctioneer. No one seemed to realize the way the sound in my chest had been changed. For a moment I stood there, drenched in backyard light and panting, while a dozen conversations continued around me like nothing had snapped. The bat had nicked me. A shallow slice across an arm, red and stupid and not life-ending, which sounds like a ridiculous detail to highlight, but matters because it was the thing that made it undeniable. When you're hit by someone you once trusted, the cut is both physical and a map of every decision that led you there. I felt it like a sting and a ledger entry. I remember touching the cut and tasting metal on my fingers and telling myself I should probably go to the bathroom and clean it, like a normal person who had just been assaulted would, but my legs felt like someone else's. Somebody hauled me into the back of Logan's house. I think it was a friend who'd come after me when they realized I'd disappeared. And for a while, the light and warmth and music made everything blur into edges. People asked if I was okay. I said no in small, rationed syllables. Then someone called an ambulance, or maybe they didn't. Memory shutters around exact sequences, because adrenaline wants to protect you by throwing out the film. I know the cops were there later, that there were statements, that names were swapped like trading cards. I know the word assault was used, and then used again like it wanted to stain something it couldn't quite reach. The attacker, the person swinging the bat, was someone I had known in a different register. The revelation felt obscene and confusing. Not a tidy villain as horror movies give you, but the jagged shape of a private history I'd been trying to forget. In the light of the yard, she was small and furious, not cinematic. She didn't have the look of derangement I'd imagined from a stalker in the woods story. She had the look of a person who believed they'd been wronged and had decided on force. There was someone else there too. The figure who had actually swung the bat, who may have been the one waiting deeper in the trees. Or maybe she had handed it off. Maybe it was planned. The police later asked questions that implied possibility. Later, people connected dots in group chats like amateur detectives. I learned then that other people are better at turning messy events into clean narratives than the people who lived them. I ran. At some point the gold mask flew from my hand and skittered over a root, and as it rolled it caught the porchlight and flashed like a small accusation. I don't know if I left with other people trying to corral me or if I fled alone. Both are true in the way memory blends. But I left the party convinced of only two things. First, that the summer I'd been imagining with lazy mornings and beer-sticky afternoons had been punctured, and second, that people I'd been intimate with could become weapons. The immediate days after were a fog of calls, texts I didn't answer, and the kind of triage that comes with surviving something that leaves you more rattled than physically harmed. There were bruises, Not just the kind that showed under skin, but the kind that lived under your voice. I kept expecting the person I'd dated to show up at every gathering, to be waiting in lines and between classes and on porches, and for a while that expectation was more real than anything else. I took to sitting with my back to the wall in crowded rooms and rehearsing exits like a pessimist. I stopped drinking to black out. I stopped letting people get behind me without seeing their hands. I refused to be flippant about my safety the way I once was. What really gnawed, though, wasn't the hit or the evening's chaos. It was the way a short relationship, something we both agreed had been over with conversations and polite avoidance, had animated into something ugly and violent. It taught me that sometimes the dissolution of a relationship doesn't stay private. It migrates into public and, worse, into plans. It forced me to look at how the little cruelties you file away can accumulate into grudges so sharp they become instruments. That summer, every unexpected text made my stomach drop. Every knock at the door sounded like the prelude to someone swinging something heavy. People asked why I hadn't pressed charges, why I hadn't pursued more. In the messy aftermath, there were reasons: shame, fatigue, the hope that time would smooth the raw edges. There were practical things, uncertainties about what exactly had happened, small inconsistencies in what witnesses remembered, a reluctance to drag people we still bumped into through legal machinery. I learned that the justice system is slow and the social system is slower. Sometimes chaos sits in your lap while the rest of the world goes on pretending it's Tuesday. The rest of summer was quiet in the loudest possible way. I kept telling myself I'd learn to laugh about it, because humor is a shield and because it's embarrassing to be afraid of things you used to do with ease. But the truth was simpler. My laugh was thinner, and the places I'd once stumbled through with friends suddenly felt like traps. I stopped going to house parties in the woods. I stopped letting strangers touch my arm, just because. I turned into that person I used to mock. The one who texted to say she's on her way, who checked the back seat before getting in. The bar for feeling safe lowered to a sill so small it fit in the palm of my hand. That feeling of having to redraw the map of normal is what carried into the last story, the one that still grips me when night is too quiet and the house hums with too much electricity. I was subbing at a high school the spring semester, filling in for a teacher who had taken a leave. The gig was supposed to be temporary and mostly boring. Distribute worksheets, call on students who didn't raise their hands, and shepherd seniors through the last dull assignments before graduation, loosened them like a spring. Ben was a student in one of those classes. He was the kind of kid you didn't remember the name of until you saw his face again. Quiet, late to raise his hand, eyes that watched without necessarily engaging. If you squinted, you might give him the adjective unassuming. He sat in the same seat day after day and did not make much of a ripple. The first odd thing was small, and the sort of detail you can file under weird but explainable, until it stops fitting into that box. I stayed late one afternoon because I hadn't finished grading, the fat stack of papers that becomes a kind of homework tax. When I pushed open the classroom door, there was a posture at the back of the room that made my skin go slack. A figure hunched over on a desk, as if waiting for someone. I called out, "Ben?" softly, because you don't want to startle a kid you don't know well. He looked up, and for a second there was this unnatural stillness, like he'd been carved out of the chair. He muttered something about waiting for a pencil or a phone charger, a mundane excuse. He lingered, as if he had the right to be there and should not be questioned. Later, when I left, I found my purse on the teacher's desk, slightly ajar. I remember the nauseous little squeeze of it being out of place, and the way I dismissed it as forgetfulness. Maybe I had left it like that and forgotten. I blamed myself for being scatterbrained until worry took the edge of the blame and made it something colder. A week later, a small thing happened that unsettled me more. I found my desk rearranged just enough that I noticed. A sticky note I hadn't left was tucked inside a textbook. When I asked around, Ben was always around the edges of explanations, like a shadow that passes behind a conversation. People said he was quiet, people shrugged, no one accused him of anything. No one seemed to realize that the rearrangement could be something more than clumsiness. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the same things people tell themselves when they don't want to see that the world has shifted. But there was an unease that started to live in the bones of me, the slow tightening of a strap on a suitcase. I started leaving the lights on in the classroom after hours and locking doors I hadn't been careful to lock before. I was predictably the person who made jokes about being paranoid. The jokes didn't make the feeling go away. Then the shed. It was an ordinary Saturday in late May. The yard had that smell that gardens get in spring, a combination of mown grass and something floral that seems apologetic for the pollen. My husband was outside, tinkering. He liked to take things apart and put them back together in ways that made him feel like he controlled the world. For reasons that, even now, sound like a simple adult's decision, he stayed out hours longer than intended to fix a stubborn lawnmower. He called for me from the yard at one point, maybe to show off that he'd fixed it, maybe to ask about dinner, and then later went to the shed because he thought he'd heard a sound. I stayed inside with the baby monitor on because our son was asleep and the rooms felt like vaults full of quiet. Time stretches differently when you're alone in a house you know intimately. Every floorboard seems to have a new voice. At around midnight I woke because something had jarred me awake. The monitor crackled with the softology of an infant's breath, and then a thud downstairs that I couldn't place. I chalked it up to the heat or the cat, because that's what you do when your brain wants to keep things ordinary. Then I saw him. He was in the hallway outside my son's bedroom, like a thing stood between shadows. Not in the blurry way you see eyes in a fence at night, but carefully, achingly real. He stood with an odd calmness, like someone practicing an emotion in a mirror. For a breath, I couldn't move. My body misfiled the signal for fight or flight, and neither arrived. He was wearing the jacket he'd had in class sometimes, the same neutral expression, and he looked impossibly like a student who didn't belong in people's houses at midnight. He opened the door. I remember the small domestic details with painful clarity, the nightlight giving the room a lemon glow, the way the child's blanket had twisted at the corner into a small peak, the slow, perfect rhythm of the son's breathing like a wind bell. Ben, if it was Ben, and I use that name because that is what I have, stepped into the room and moved like a person who believed they had permission. He walked over to the bed and stood there. I could see his silhouette against the soft sheet. He didn't scream, didn't make a sound meant to terrify or threaten, but the act itself was a violation, like a hand across a photograph. Every instinct in me told me to scream. Instead, I grabbed my phone. My hands were rigid. I fumbled a number to my husband, whispering nonsensical things about the shed, about the porch, about anything that might get him to come. He heard the panic in my voice and started running down the stairs. By the time he reached the hallway, Ben had moved toward the window like he knew the architecture of the house. He was climbing out as my husband barreled toward him, grabbing at him with a force that said, "Stop," but wasn't a plan. Ben didn't argue. He didn't raise his hands. He slipped through the window like someone who'd rehearsed exits and then dropped down into the dark and ran. My husband chased him into the yard, yelling, then sprinted after. I stood in the doorway holding the phone to my ear, the monitor's steady breathing a cruel counterpoint. For a minute, the whole neighborhood felt like it had muted itself to watch. My husband called police. He said he had seen the boy climb. He had watched the way Ben vanished across fences and into alleys like a stain on the night. The neighbors came out in their underwear and sneakers, eyes round. The police arrived. They took statements. They walked the perimeter with flashlights, their beams cutting slices into other people's yards. They asked me the decisive questions. Did I actually see him enter the room? Did anyone see him out the window? Could he have snuck in through another way? I told them what I could, that I had seen a figure, that I believed it was Ben because of his posture and jacket and the suspicious timing with the class incidents. But when they checked the scene, the house offered them nothing. No fingerprints that distinguished themselves, no CCTV that covered that window, no neighbor who had watched him go over the fence. My husband had seen a young man run, but fences and alleys swallow people and produce only the echo of a shadow. Ben denied being out that night when the police spoke to him at school. He told them he was home doing homework and that he couldn't have been where I said. He had an alibi from one of his friends, a friend who said he'd seen Ben at the skate park later that night. It didn't line up neatly, but law enforcement deals with proof and timestamps and corroboration, not with the brittle evidence of a woman's dream of wrongness. Their conclusion was practical and maddening. Lack of evidence, nothing to charge, no probable cause to detain someone who insisted he had been home. They suggested locks and told me to be careful. The officers were kind in a professional sort of way. They handed me pamphlets about home safety like Band-Aids. That phrase, "there's nothing we can do," is small and bureaucratic and edged like a knife. It cuts you where you live by telling you that institutions will not always rearrange themselves for your fear. I felt like something thin and important had been stolen from me. The assumption that home is a harbor where bad things stay out. After that night, every creak of the house was a potential trespass. Every late knock was an accusation. I started sleeping with a knife in the nightstand, which is the kind of thing people either laugh about or call your counselor for. After a week of that, my husband insisted on installing cameras. We bought the cheapest ones we could find and set them up like a skeleton of suspicion. One pointed at the driveway, one at the yard, one at the side window my husband had seen Ben slip through. The pictures they saved were grainy and flat and terrible in the way they catch truth. A pixelated smear that promises a face but never quite gives the comfort of recognition. For a long time I replayed those frames like incantations, hoping for proof. Sometimes the cameras caught a raccoon. Sometimes they caught nothing at all. Long after the police left and the new locks were installed, I changed. I stopped accepting my husband's offers to take out the trash at night. I turned the porch light on every evening and left it burning like a lighthouse. I avoided school events that extended past dusk. My husband tried to be patient. He installed better outdoor lighting and motion sensors, and he held our son the way people hold fragile things. Our son learned at a young age that sleep could be interrupted and house rules could be stricter than his friends. For months my husband drove the route to work that felt safest. Together we walked the fence line and listened to neighborhood gossip like divination. The practical fallout extended further. We put the house on the market. It's a decision born of grief and stealth. Sometimes you have to leave the geography that was violated so that the memory cannot sit like a splinter in your side. Moving felt like defeat and liberation all at once. We sold the house months later to a family who loved the yard and had different eyes for the cut of the light. I still think about the bedroom sometimes, sitting under a blanket and knowing that at one point a pair of shoes had been less than a yard away from where my son slept. It makes me want to scream and cry and put my hands on every sleeping thing I love. I want to be clear about a few things, because memory is a collection of reliable and unreliable threads braided together. This is my recollection. People remember parts differently. Some details have smoothed out like pebbles in a river, and others are sharp as broken glass. When I tell you this, I'm not asking you to place bets on truth. I'm asking you to take the emotional ledger as it was carried inside my chest. Whether Ben was exactly where I said, or whether he had been somewhere else that night, is an open question in the way many traumatic events remain open. What is not open is the fact that the aftermath reshaped how we lived. The 3 nights I've told you about, the tunnel, the party, the house, are connected by a thread that isn't dramatic so much as it is structural. They all begin with a miscalculation, a small invitation that felt safe enough because we were young, or trusting, or both. We were dared into dark places with flashlights and beer and a cheap rubber mask. We were charmed into following a gold mask into trees because it felt like a movie. We were polite and helpful, trusting that strangers and acquaintances would respect the boundaries we expected them to. Each time, we misread the world, and for a minute, the universe corrected us with a shove that left a bruise. Those shoves didn't always have tidy outcomes. Sometimes they left us limping for a little while, and then rejoining whatever social life we had before. Sometimes they changed the shape of our homes. Sometimes they stripped away the presumption that closeness is only ever benign. Mostly they left questions. The tunnel had eyes that don't fit cleanly into any explanation. The woods had a cruelty that felt personal. The house had a trespass that taught me to lock things I took for granted. They all share that unsettled ending, the kind where you don't get a satisfying last scene. You get a list of measures you took afterward. Longer routes home, fewer late nights, cameras, bolts. I tell these stories now because summer is coming again, and there's an odd thrill in feeling like you've survived a minor war and can stand and point at the scars. I also tell them as a warning without being moralistic. Curiosity is not inherently bad, but it is not a shield. Bravery is not the same as invincibility. People who hurt you are sometimes not monsters from movies, but people who once loved you, or people who were hungry in the wrong ways. Institutions will do what they can, which sometimes is not enough, and then it's up to you to reconfigure how you move through the world. If there's a takeaway, maybe it's this: safety is fragile and often made, not given. It's created by locks and cameras and the people who show up for you, and it's also created by the choices you make when you're tired and the ones you make after you've been frightened. I don't want to be the person who lives forever in fear. I want to be the person who learned her limits and respected them. But I also won't lie. Some nights, the dark still sits like a question at the base of my throat. So here they are, 3 true stories to haunt your summer break. Not in the way a ghost haunts an attic, but in the way a doubt haunts a habit. Persistent, nagging, always softening the edges of what you used to take for granted. We laughed because we could, and because it was easier than asking for help. We were reckless because we were young, and because daring felt like freedom. We paid in small, inconvenient ways, and then rearranged our lives. If you liked the chills, hit subscribe and tell me your scariest summer memory below. I'll read the best ones in the next video. And if anything I said tonight sits with you like a stone, pass it along to someone who might need to hear it. Summer is supposed to be bright, but that doesn't mean we have to pretend the dark isn't there.